Hey everyone, and welcome back to Group Therapy. I'm one of your hosts, licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Kristen Casey.
I'm licensed psychologist, Dr. Jessica Rabon.
I'm licensed psychologist, Dr. J.
And I'm licensed clinical social worker, Kristen Gingrich.
This week, we are talking about hot topics in mental health. I'm so excited to hear your questions and contributions for this episode. So settle in, take a seat, and welcome to Group Therapy. But first, let's get to the reflection question from the week. You had some great responses. The question was, tell us how you will know if you're people-pleasing in the future. What will be your signs? One of them, I know, this is such a good question. So if I say yes and have trouble saying no, was one answer.
Totally.
Yep. If I stop and take a second to ask myself, quote, do I really want this before I make a decision?
Ooh,
That's a really good one.
I like that.
Right? Yeah, you're taking space. I think that's pretty dope.
Love.
Now, let's get to hot topics of mental health. We've all been on social media the past few years. How do y'all feel about the fact that some mental health topics are quote unquote trending right now?
Can I just first say, happy Mental Health Awareness Month.
Ooh, yes.
It's
This is every
Absolutely.
therapist creator's month. This is our time to shine.
We prepared all year for this.
This is it. This is the month. So
It
anyways,
is.
hot topics.
Hot topics. What do we think?
I mean, it's great when the people who talk on them actually know what they're talking about.
We're starting with sass this episode.
Okay. There's that.
Yes.
Or they're actually like qualified to talk about them.
Unless someone preferences with this is my experience. This is just my experience, which I think is super cool. I love that part about social media. People can share their experience. Beautiful. But a lot of times we don't get that. Hey, I'm just sharing with you what's worked for me, what has been my experience. I'm not a doctor here. Or I'm not licensed.
I think it's great that there's a conversation about mental health.
Totally.
I personally find, though, and I would love to get you all's thoughts, the topics that often are trending, the definition has become like misconstrued in some way. Or they're things like I never learned about or talked about in grad school.
Yeah.
And we'll touch on some of them today, but they're like pop psychology terms a lot of times, which I definitely have mixed feelings about. But then I think, the fact that we're having a conversation about mental health is great.
So we have a couple of topics that we're going to touch on today. But first I wanted to get some ideas from y'all. When you hear the word pop psychology, like Jess is saying, when you're hearing the words like, oh, I'm having the exact same experience as everybody else with this one term, just say the term is like gaslighting. That's the one that we're going to start with. When you hear that term, what do you think of in terms of everybody having the exact same experience? Do you think everybody can have the exact same experience with gaslighting? Or do you think that these terms are like, hey, we could define them and everybody has their own experience? What do you think?
It's funny the parallel that comes to mind of like when a word comes into vogue, it starts to be used globally before a lot of people understand what it means. Like I almost think when mental health was starting to be a thing, at some point people learned the term, like just the word bipolar, and they just started saying for anything that may look like mental health, oh, they're bipolar. I see the same thing happen with terms like gaslighting, toxic. I know all the hot topics we're about to get into. You see it happen where you're like, I'm glad that you know that that's a term that exists. And I don't think you know what it means. And I don't blame you for it. I don't blame you because you know the term exists. But maybe we just need to pull back a little bit and be like, okay, but what does the word actually mean? What are we talking about here?
Exactly. Which is why I think we should define all the terms that we're going to talk about today. So let's start with gaslighting. Who wants to take this one?
I can take this one. So
Let's do it.
gaslighting is a form of manipulation where the victim, I know people have strong feelings about that term, but the target of the gaslighting starts to question the validity of their own thoughts, perception of reality, and memories. So this can lead to the person feeling confused. They may question if what they're thinking, saying, experiencing is real. Lower confidence, self-esteem, and uncertainty about like oneself, one's mental stability. Because if somebody is telling you your worldview is not your worldview, or what you said or didn't actually happen, you're going to start questioning, like, am I sane? What's going on?
Totally. And why do we think this is a hot topic right now? I see it everywhere. I literally see gaslighting like every couple of videos.
I think we live in a society with a lot of disagreement right now.
Mhm.
And that's where I feel like the misconception comes in of, if someone disagrees with you, that does not mean they're gaslighting you. I think the times it becomes gaslighting is when somebody's trying to undermine and attack your truth versus they're sharing their own perspective. Yes, this can get gray, it can get muddy, but gaslighting, exactly as just laid out, is a very intense way that somebody's trying to create doubt of someone's own perceptions of things, not just, I disagree with you. And again, we have a lot of conflict going on, especially in American culture right now, where I think people are feeling like if someone disagreed with me, then that must be gaslighting, where it's not necessarily the same thing.
100%. Yeah, I even think the thing that comes to mind too is that when people are in relationships, I think that there could be a non-mutual breakup, right? And just say people didn't agree on the breakup or didn't agree on the terms of the relationship or the breakup. And I think sometimes the term gets thrown around when people, like you said, Justin, are simply disagreeing. I think with gaslighting, the notable feature is that manipulation and having the person question their reality. And then you start to think, like, did that actually happen? Like, they're telling me it didn't happen. Did it happen? And I think that questioning yourself, questioning the situation, even if you've known something to be true, that's kind of what comes to mind when I think of gaslighting.
I was just going to say, and going back to like why it's a hot topic, I think, especially in the social media world, and this applies to more than just gaslighting, a lot of times when we have like a singular word to describe an experience, people are like, oh, that's a word for what I've been feeling. Even if their understanding of what that word is not 100% accurate. So it's easy to grab onto a term and then apply that to many situations.
Totally.
Because we're all looking for answers. And if we have a term that communicates, you know, I know we talked about some misconceptions about disagreeing, but like, oh, I've definitely been in situations where I was made to question my reality. Saying gaslighting is a lot easier than explaining every little detail of what happened. So I think singular
never thought of
words
it
kind
that
of
way.
catch on as trendy because it gives people a way to describe their experiences in a singular term or phrase.
Yeah. I'm even thinking about like pop psychology, like Jess, you mentioned before, of like these bold statements that kind of are so general that potentially people could relate to, but it might not actually be all encompassing of the experience for every single person. And I think with gaslighting, that's that same way. People just want to feel validated in their experience and not have to describe it in such detail, you know, and online you only get so many characters, you know, to type something out. So,
Absolutely.
all right, next one. Narcissism. I'm going to take this one. It's a hot one. So when I think of narcissism, I think that this one is thrown around quite a bit. And I want to preface this with, I'm not a narcissism expert. I've worked with narcissism a little bit. We're trained in grad school to work with personality disorders and stuff like that. But I do think when we're thinking about narcissism, we have to really think about what it means. What is it? And is it only narcissistic personality disorder, or could somebody be narcissistic without having a personality disorder? What is it? So there's a difference between narcissistic like traits and then narcissistic personality disorder. And for our listeners out there who might be new, a personality disorder is a way to capture someone's overall behavior as it relates to their entire life. It's very chronic. It's their mode of operation in multiple areas of life. It's kind of like these dispositional fixated traits that are in clusters in personality disorders. So you might have narcissistic like traits, but it doesn't always mean that you'll have narcissistic personality disorder. And when I think about NPD, that's the acronym for it, I think it's a pattern of grandiosity, the need for admiration, and the notable feature with narcissistic personality disorder is a lack of empathy. So kind of like when we were talking about gaslighting, I want to know y'all's thoughts on this. When somebody is disagreeing with you, or somebody might say, hey, that's not my experience, this is my experience, or something like that, it might feel like they don't have empathy, but do they have empathy? We're not sure, right? So with NPD, there's a lot of psychological testing that you have to go through to really identify this. But I do want to know, do you think that people can have those narcissistic-like traits, or is it just NPD?
No, I mean, I think people can have traits. I mean, that's the whole point a lot of times of personality disorders, that there are personality traits. They're just clustered together to the point that it is impacting functioning and become chronic. So there are pieces of that, some people just have them as personality traits, and it's not a disorder. They're not disordered. But it's also, I think, where it can be misconstrued too, where we see this too, of where someone holds themselves in high regard, they have confidence, they set boundaries, and they set standards for themselves of how, they'll be treated, how they hold themselves, and suddenly that's seen as narcissistic, when the reality is it's not. And so I think, kind of going to the one side too of this of kind of narcissism, where it hits in the negative, is like it's being used as like this negative connotation to describe someone when it's not even accurate.
I'm so glad you hit on like the confidence aspect, KBI, because yeah, I fully believe that we all probably have a little bit of narcissism, at least at times, trait wise. Like if we think of, having a positive sense of self, you know, we think of, grandiosity and MPD, but, we probably all like, when we're praised for a good thing. Okay, I said all. I don't like to talk in absolutes. A lot of us like to be praised, or we like that positive feedback. And, there's probably certain situations, like if we have a sense of self-importance, that it can be very adaptive. If we value ourselves, it's when, like KBI already said, it becomes pathological or disrupts functioning or relationships.
Totally. Yeah, the word I often use is self-centered. I think a lot of us are self-centered. I think it's also good to be self-centered at times, as we just came off our people-pleasing episode. I think I try to get all my people pleasers out there to be a little more self-centered. Like start with you, start with what you're feeling and experiencing. But yeah, especially with narcissistic personality disorder, the exploitation, the lack of empathy, those two for me really jump off, that this is a common interpersonal pattern, where I don't think exploitative, lack of empathy, the grandiosity, I think that's pretty far from being self-centered or being grounded in yourself, or at times doing what is better for you that might not be better for others. Like it feels like on a spectrum, versus when I think of someone who just doesn't have the empathy and exploits others, that's a big distance and a big gap.
Oh, yeah. I really like that you said that, because I feel like everybody should be the main character in their own life. And because that's what life's all about. Like you're living your own life, not other people's lives, right? And I think, like you said, it gets to a point where it becomes really, really, I would say, even unhelpful just for relationships, when there is that exploitative nature, because you're doing things for your own personal gain and not necessarily for the relationship or the goals of the relationship. And it's pretty obvious, but some people can have traits, and it doesn't mean that they're a narcissist, so to say.
I was just gonna say, and someone can just be a dick and not be a narcissist. Like they can just be a dick. Like
True.
I feel like we need a working definition of what defines a dick.
Yeah.
No, but I do
KBI
I
beyond
do
that.
get what you're saying.
Yeah,
I get what you're saying.
like just some people are McAssholes,
Yeah.
and like it doesn't mean that they are that they're a narcissist. They're just maybe lack some social skills. Maybe they just
Sure.
don't get along or have some anger management issues. Like it doesn't mean that they are a narcissist to the core.
All right. Y'all ready for the next one?
Let's do it.
Roll into dissociation. Who wants to take this one?
I'll take it.
Let's go.
Because dissociation is just when I'm in class and I'm real bored and I space out for a bit, right?
So like when you talk, that's like me.
What? Say that again?
When you talk, that's me.
Yeah. 100%. This is completely valid. You know what? It's interesting because inattention is common. It's a common human experience. How often, how rampant it happens gets into other things. We could start talking about ADHD. We could start, again, talking about this topic of dissociation. But when you really are getting down to the nuts and bolts of what is dissociation versus just inattention, dissociation, again, is this period of time where people can lose track of place. They can lose track of how much time has passed by. They can lose track of events, who they're with. It's not just I'm in class and I'm no longer paying attention. Like if you're in a boring lecture or your boring work meeting and someone comes up to you and goes, "Hey, where are you? What's going on? How much time do you think's passed?" Most of us could pretty much nail that. Like, "Oh, I'm kind of spaced out there. I think I've been, daydreaming for about 7 minutes here." But some people think of that as a very mild form of dissociation. However, when we talk about dissociation as like a clinical concept or like a mental health problem, people, again, they're having large memory gaps that are impacting their daily functioning. And then people can have experiences called depersonalization, which is this feeling of being outside your body. People can have this experience called derealization, which is an experience of, am I in a dream? Is anything real? So these are real interesting concepts that can be triggered by trauma, high stress, high anxiety, and even certain substances. And I also failed to mention dissociative identity disorder, DID, which lots of people were very interested in.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was thinking of DID, which was multiple personality disorder at one point. And when I think about it, I think there's not only disturbances with like memory and time, but also identity. People feel like they don't know who they are when they lose these huge gaps of time. They're like waking up in places that they didn't realize that they were there. And usually with DID, we notice that people have usually a history of trauma. Really, really depends on the person, but not to say that everybody who experiences trauma will have DID. It is a pretty rare disorder. I've only seen it in clinical practice once or twice when I worked inpatient. Have any of y'all worked with DID before?
No.
Yeah. I even think about for people with DID, they also have, these, I think the notable feature that really people cling on to is people who have like multiple alters. So there's a host personality and then there's a bunch of alters. And sometimes the host personality isn't aware of the alters because they go into that dissociative state and they don't even realize that this alter personality is kind of coming out. It's not the same as, when you're feeling spicy one day and you're like wanting to be a little more confident versus, your normal introverted self. This is, a really long-standing issue for people.
Well, and it's a very distinctive shift. Like those alters are very different than maybe like the host personality. From what, again, I've never worked with anybody with DID, but from what I've learned, it is like your host personality might be a very timid person, but one of your alters may be very, very aggressive. You may have an alter that speaks in a different like dialect in a way, like a different accent from just those types of things. And so it's pretty distinctive.
So, yeah, why do we think dissociation? Why is it hot? Jess, you were about to speak. Maybe you're going to say something different.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think kind of jumping ahead to misconceptions, I think one of the misconceptions is that dissociation is DID.
Yes.
But going back to why it's hot, and this is kind of like the answer I gave for gaslighting, I think there's a misunderstanding of what dissociation is. And so if somebody zones out, oh, I dissociated. If have lapse in memory for a reason. Oh, I dissociated. Going to what K10 said, it's not just like shifts in mood. I'm feeling spicy one day, but if somebody has a lack of understanding about it, oh, that's a ultra different personality. And once again, it goes back to people have a singular word that they feel relates to their experience and could describe what they're experiencing, even if that is not what the true meaning of the word is.
Well, and I saw this the other day where someone said, oh, I dissociated and scrolled TikTok for 3 hours. I'm like, no, you distracted yourself and scrolled TikTok for 3 hours. So again, going back to like what Jess said, is like that not quite understanding what that term is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when
you may
I
not
think
have been you may not have been present in anything outside of that little square box that was your phone, but you did not, it's not dissociation.
I love that you brought that up, because I always think, are you fixated or are you disassociating? You know? And I think for people who experience trauma, when I work with my clients who experience trauma and they have those dissociative experiences, like dissociative amnesia or something like that, it really, how they describe it is their body is almost trying to keep them safe. So they're going somewhere else mentally so that they could deal with whatever's going on, you know, or if they have a trigger or a trauma trigger, they might have lapses in time, you know, because it's just too painful to acknowledge the reality of what's going on. So I do think within the context of different disorders and different experiences, the reasoning for dissociation could be different. And it's not only DID, like Jess said too.
Yeah, and it's interesting too of like why some of these things might be hot, because I think people get flavors of things.
Yeah.
Like I think, not to say everyone's had this experience, but like with feeling outside your body, like I've had a lot of clients who have like social anxiety moments where they have to give the speech in front of the class. And they're like, no, I was literally, for a moment, I was watching myself. And I was like, what? Like I was literally out of my body because of the intense anxiety that giving a speech can bring up. But it's when people can be stuck in these states rampantly, right? And it could be someone with social anxiety, could be. It's a different thing. Like I love how we're talking about inattention, we're talking about fixation, and then we're talking about what is dissociation. And these are all different nuances, different levels, sort of, again, a little bit different, but we're nailing it on the head as far as I think people just hear this term over and over again. And when they would try to blanket use it, but for someone like derealization, having worked with many people that was their trauma response of kind of chronically going through their life and feeling like, what is real? Is this all a dream? It's just very different than sometimes a few of us might wake up and kind of have a few moments of derealization. Am I still sleeping? Am I still dreaming? Sort of like, as we've talked to in previous episodes, of people can have an intrusive thought now and again, right? You're driving your car. What if I swerve into the other lane? Versus someone like myself who with OCD, where that's a daily occurrence that can happen hundreds and hundreds of times.
Yeah. And it impairs functioning, you know, and you have to compensate for it, right? It's different when it's a clinical picture versus, you know, a fleeting experience. And I think that's why people are attaching to these topics and why they're hot too, because they just want so desperately, in my opinion, to feel seen and perceived and validated in their experience. And it's hard to talk to your friends about like, hey, I was out of my body before. They're like, what? You know, it's kind of hard to have these conversations unless you find like-minded people who are talking about it. All right, next up, mother wound and inner child healing. Just going to like slowly toss this over to KBI.
I mean, who else would take it, honestly? I mean, if you look up mother wound in the Webster Dictionary, it's just my face.
Just your face.
It's just a big picture. See, not your average therapist, because I sum that up in a nutshell.
I love it.
So kind of a little bit different, I will say, like inner child work and the mother wound, that's a little bit different than maybe the ones that we've discussed, is that these are more, I think that these are more descriptive terms that take, you know, the mother wound is all about, it's an attachment trauma that creates a sense of confusion and devastation that is related to the relationship with your mother. You could also call it the father wound, the grandparent wound. I think it's more of a more descriptive term than it's just to give like a, I don't know, like an organized way. A lot of times the mother wound can make us feel, unloved, unsafe, abandoned, feeling like we're unworthy of care, fearful of expressing ourselves, depending on, again, the nature of that. It usually talks about the mother wound specifically is tended towards daughters more frequently, but can be directed towards sons. But it, like, this topic specifically is more just gauged towards that relationship that you have with your mother. So I identify as having a mother wound due to the nature of the relationship and the trauma that I experienced with my mother, and the repercussions of that I see a difference in the repercussions of that with the relationship that I had with her than I had maybe with my father. I don't have a father wound. My father, we had a great. So I think that that finds kind of like that balance. It's the same with inner child work. It's kind of looking at healing that inner child who was wounded by whatever trauma you want to identify. If you want to identify it as the mother wound, father wound, just everything that you've experienced, and really looking and saying, like, looking more internally and saying, as an adult, what can I give that internal child that lives inside of me? What can I give them to begin that healing process?
Absolutely. I think there's also an interesting piece, because you summed that up so well, that you can do inner child work that isn't necessarily to do with trauma.
Yes.
I think a lot of people do work to tap into their inner child, this sense of childlike being, this playfulness, this, like, I'm thinking of people who are chronically putting themselves in burnout, that they can go to this childlike place of, like, sort of like innocence and play and creativity. However, when we talk about inner child healing, that's kind of different, because we're kind of assuming that there's, as you said, there's been damage that's been done, like from early life experiences, and it's more trauma focused. So I think some people do inner child work that can help with a lot of different areas, like in their life, stress, burnout, interpersonal relationships in some ways. But then inner child healing, again, we think more trauma focused.
Well, and I love that inner child work, because I think, as we grow up and become adults, I actually just made a post about this where I was talking, like, when did I stop finding joy in the small things?
Yo.
And so, like, you know
Yeah.
what? I can tell you straight up right now, when I go buy a box of mac and cheese, I am guaranteed to buy the princesses before I buy the regular box.
Why
Like,
not?
I'm telling you, the one, you know what I love on a nice hot summer day? Those plastic ice pops that you rip off the top and it cuts the side of your mouth, and then you
Come
suck all
on.
the juice. Like,
Come on.
like, and I one of the things
Those-
I remind, like, people are always like, how do I work on my inner child? And I'm like, when you're like, do it at the grocery store. Like, that's my favorite place of, like, I'll walk down, the aisle and I'll be like, oh my God, I used to love fudgesicles as a child. Let's get a box. Or, like,
is bringing
the
it
ice
back.
cream truck, the creepy ice cream truck is coming down the road. You best your bet I'm going to get a wonky-eyed SpongeBob off that truck
The
Yo.
SpongeBob was always
with the
my
bubblegum
jam.
eyeballs.
Yeah.
Like, it's
The
allowing
gum is unwelcome.
No,
Why
don't
is
understand.
gum in frozen treats? But
it
I
made
still
sense,
agree.
But it's like hunkering down at night and watching a Pixar movie. And
Right.
so it's reminding yourself that just because you're 31 years old, you also can't enjoy kid things.
Yeah.
And giving that back to yourself, because we're so enveloped by bills and adult things and mortgages and taxes and blah 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 that sometimes we just need to eat a bowl of princess shaped Kraft mac and cheese.
Yeah.
And I will say, nothing has opened up my inner child more than being a parent.
I was going to ask you all that because I'm not a parent, and I want to know, like, if when you're raising your kids, is it like a parallel experience for you when you're thinking about your own healing, when it's inner child work, and then we could get to, like, the misconceptions and stuff.
I would say I'm definitely more like playful. Like last weekend, two weekends ago, my daughter and I went outside and played with sidewalk chalk, which I haven't played with sidewalk chalk in forever. And I did a hopscotch board, and she's only 2. She can't really do hopscotch, but like we did hopscotch and things, and it was like very fun. And, bringing back some misconception about dissociation and, not being present and things like that. I was able to be very present doing something that I did as a little girl. And that wasn't my intention doing it. It was like, she woke up at 7 a.m. and I need to fill my day with things. But yeah, I think there's definitely things as, a parent, especially, I mean, my daughter's only 2. I know Justin and I have similar age kids, and then KBI's is a little older, but I'm sure as I continue to parent and go through different life stages, there will be things that I recall from that stage of life that's healing.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. I love it. I was thinking of me and my cousin. We are starting to do on Thursday nights, we're watching anime together because that's what we did when we were younger. And we're actually going through the motions of doing diary work as well, and writing down the things that we wish we told our younger selves, like at that time. Like right now, I think we're on age 8 or 9. So we're sharing our journals with each other, and then yeah, watching anime. But why do you think that these terms are so hot right now? Why are we seeing it everywhere?
I think because we're talking about it more.
Yeah.
I mean, I talk about my mother wound all the time, and then there are still people who are like, but that's your mom. Don't talk bad about your mom. And I think that there's sometimes, trauma in general can feel very isolating. And that you feel like maybe you're the only, I always say like you're the only one who's experienced yours, but like you really do feel like you're the only one.
Mm-hmm.
And so talking about it more opens it up to really seeing like I'm not the only one who's experienced this attachment issue.
Definitely. All right. Next one. Is everything a trauma response? Who wants this one?
I got it. Short and sweet.
Let's go.
Yes. Next topic. Let's go. What's next? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Anything. I know the question was, is everything. Everything and anything can be a trauma response. I promise you, being a therapist over 10 years now, anything can associate and stick in the brain paired with trauma. Anything. We're talking smells, imagery, sounds, feelings, bodies, anything. Prove me wrong out there if you disagree, but I know it to be true. Anything can, but that's the uniqueness of trauma, of the sound of someone crunching loudly could remind you of an abusive figure in your life. A little smell of burning rubber could remind you of the car accidents. Anything, which is why, on the one hand, we could make those videos online forever, because anything could be a trauma, related to trauma. And that the cool part about those is it opens people's mind to be like, yo, I didn't realize that, but that is tied to my trauma. The smell of peanut butter actually relates to my childhood and the trauma I went through.
Yeah.
But no, it could be anything and everything. So there's nothing wrong with sharing that. And it's all the above.
So Justin, it's so interesting how you answered that and how I would answer that, because my answer would have been no for the same exact reasons that you listed, in the sense that, is everything a trauma response? No, anything could be a trauma response, in the sense that, like, I'm thinking of people pleasing.
Yeah.
But this is why this question is so interesting, because I've seen so many different camps. And whenever I hear, like, is everything a trauma response? I'm like, no, not everything is a trauma response for every single person. Could any symptom be a trauma response? Yes, based on their history. And I think about our like people pleasing episode, and we got that great group member question, like, is people pleasing only a trauma response? It could be for some people, but because I'm a people pleaser does not necessarily mean it is due to my trauma.
True.
So, I mean, and this is why I love the podcast too, because like my gut reaction was like, no, but everything you said, I agree with. It's just how we interpret the question.
It absolutely is, because I'm used to seeing all the videos that say, did you know, like feeling that vibration of your phone going off, it can be a trauma response or is a trauma response. And I'm like, totally, could be.
Yeah.
Definitely could be. If you were in an abusive household and someone was overworked and their beepers and phones were going off and that was elicited to you getting screamed at, it could be. Definitely could be. So it's like any of those videos, I'm always like, you're correct. It definitely could be. But you're right. It's semantics.
It is,
yeah.
but it's so interesting.
And I mean, I think peanut butter is a really great example, or the vibration. That could be a trauma response for someone, and another person could be like, I have absolutely no connection to that. That's not a trauma response for me. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think it depends on the person. And I like to always think about, how is this connected or not connected to PTSD when we think about the clinical picture? And it looks different. You could have a trauma response and not have PTSD, or you could have a trauma response and it could be a part of that diagnosis for you too. So
Totally.
all right. Last one. Self-diagnosis.
Ooh.
We're going to take this one. Oh, it's hot. It's hot. It's burning. Oh, all right. So I love this one because I have a lot of clients who come to me and they'll share TikToks with me and be like, this is what I mean when I say A, B, and C, when they're talking about their own experiences. So self-diagnosis is when you're diagnosing or identifying psychological or medical conditions that you either align with or you think you have. So anybody out there has been on WebMD, Googling whatever symptom they have, and they're like, oh my gosh, I have the worst thing in the world, right? They're like, oh my gosh, I have this. I think when it comes to psychology and when it comes to mental health, it's so easy to think about all of these different symptoms. And you might think, oh, it might be this one diagnosis, And I think it depends on your condition and what you're looking at. But it could actually be kind of harmful at times. And it could also be so helpful. So I think there's two ends of the spectrum here. And the one thing where I could think it could be helpful is when you think of over-the-counter medications. So I'm going to cringe when I say this, but I'm going to say this out loud. So if you're having issues sleeping and you pull ZzzQuil or diphenhydramine, which is Benadryl, right? You're like, I'm having trouble sleeping. I'm going to take this drug, right? You're not getting diagnosed with insomnia. You're not going to somebody, but you're just taking this because you're experiencing that symptom. So it could be helpful to like mitigate certain symptoms. On the other end, if you think it's a diagnosis, but you might be wrong, you're prone to error, So I always think it's helpful to get checked out from a medical professional, but I don't think that self-diagnosis is necessarily harmful all of the time, like some people might think. I think it's helpful to have an idea and then to bring it to your healthcare professional and be like, this is what I think I have, or what do you think about this? And it starts the conversation, which I think is kind of what we're talking about the whole episode. But what do y'all think?
Yeah, I'm in the camp that we all probably self-diagnose to some extent because that's what would prompt us to seek out treatment.
Yeah.
Even if we don't know the name for it, most people, unless they have a lot of privilege and access to a lot of resources, do not seek out a therapist just because they want a therapist. There is usually a reason, and usually that reason is like, oh, I've been feeling depressed lately and I looked up the symptoms and I think I might have depression or whatever it is. So I think we all engage in self-diagnosis to some extent. I don't think it's always harmful. I know mental health care is not always accessible, and there are certain conditions I feel that are much more nuanced that would be better suited if the individual had resources to seek out a professional to be diagnosed by.
Yeah, because I think about differential diagnosis and I think about just all the overlap in symptoms, even just depression. If you think about depression, you could think about depression, but then it could also be so many other things. And the person might not be privy to all that information, but any information is better than nothing, in my opinion, just to start that whole process, especially with accessibility.
So did you have a transition?
I don't have one, but I was going to just wing it because I didn't know if you.
Well, I was going to say, so
talking
about accessibility, making research more accessible.
Hey.
We're moving on to the Google Scholar Shorts. We're going to kind of mix it up this week, do something different because we want to spend more time on your group member questions. So we're just going to cut to the chase. The question I'm going to pose to you all, how do you think narcissism and social media use are related to one another?
Oh, I feel like this is so sticky.
My first reaction is more, and then I thought about this thing and I go less. A narcissistic is less. Don't know. I have no
I'll say
idea.
there's a big old correlation.
What
Negative,
direction?
positive.
I think
I don't know. There's just a correlation.
Yeah, well
Guys, I didn't do a dissertation. I don't know what any of that means.
Well, you're right.
credit.
There's probably a correlation.
There's
Yeah,
just a correlation.
yeah, that's all you need to say. Not causation.
You are
but a
correct.
correlation. Yeah.
So Salim and colleagues looked at grandiose narcissism and social media usage. And what they found, so about 30% of their sample met the cutoff for having narcissistic traits and behavior. And all 30% of those individuals were heavy users of social media, defined by spending 4+ hours on social media a day, suggesting a positive correlation between narcissism and social media use. And they also found that people who post multiple times per day had higher narcissistic traits on the MPI 16.
Are we
Jess,
okay?
if you just wanted to call us all the fuck out, you could have just been like,
That's why I
You all
picked this
bitches have
article, I'm not going to
narcissistic
lie.
This
so what
panel's
you're
sweating right now.
Yeah.
This panel's sweating.
I'm a little nervous. Oh.
Yeah. So how is that making you all feel to know that individuals who spend higher or more amounts of time on social media
you know what?
score higher on measures of narcissism?
You know what? I'm better than that. I definitely do not score on that. I am way better.
See what you did there?
I see what you did.
You're off the charts. You don't
Yeah,
even
I'm
score.
off the charts. I don't even rank on there. Like they like there's just a group of people that I'm involved with that we don't even rank. They didn't even look at us. So
I think this is such a good example of like correlation versus causation.
Oh, yeah.
It's like just because you spend that much time does not automatically mean you're a narcissist. But at the same time, social media use might be correlated with those
Mhm.
traits or vice versa.
but
So interesting.
I
Oh my
just
gosh.
think, like, if I think about it logically, though, like, you have to have certain personality traits that makes you want to put yourself out there over and over and over and over
It's
again
true.
in
Absolutely.
videos.
It is true.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, whether or not it's narcissism in a negative, toxic way,
Or confidence.
but there has to be, there has to be a piece in that says, I wake up in this morning and I'm going to put myself out to 400,000 people. Let's go.
having an identity crisis right now. Oh my god.
I just woke up and was like, hell, I'm going to fuck with these guys today.
When I came across this article, I was like, this is the one. This is the one.
I would totally see this for histrionic personality disorder.
Ooh.
I could
So,
see
like,
that too.
There's
That to me, I don't know if that's research is out there, but to
I
me,
don't
I'm
know.
like, I wouldn't hesitate. I'd be like, oh, the correlation is definitely strongly positive if you have histrionic traits or you are histrionic and how much you post to social media. But this term grandiose narcissism, it makes sense. And I don't know if I would have assumed it right away.
Yeah. Well, because if you think like kind of at the core, not thinking of NPD, but like if somebody with narcissistic traits likes admiration, approval from others, social
That's true.
media
That's true.
is going to give you that feedback.
Yeah.
Totally.
So, yeah. So if our group members are interested in reading the article, it'll be linked in the show notes. But yeah.
Ooh, that was good.
So sorry to
Absolutely.
just like, stab you all and kick you.
I'm going to
I
overthink
can
that
handle
for the
it.
rest of the night.
Yeah. Just gonna not post to social media for a week and just see what happens.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding.
So, like, maybe people won't think I'm a narcissist. Oh, Jesus.
There's going to be radio silence in May for Mental Health Awareness Month from the four of us. But no, what's not radio silent? The polls.
It's never the poll. Never radio silent.
Yes, so thank you all so much as always for engaging in the polls. I'm super excited to look at these results. So jumping right in. The first topic we talked about is everything a trauma response? The options were yes, no, and unsure.
Now I don't know how to interpret that question.
I know.
Not sure. I'm going with not sure highest.
I don't know how to interpret it because me and you interpreted that completely opposite.
Well,
I'm just
polls will
causing
show
all
the truth.
It's going to be 50-50. There we go. Right in the
50-50,
middle
yes,
ground.
no.
Very good.
Okay, so most of our group members said no at 70%.
Oh,
21% said unsure, and 9% said yes. So
Wow.
maybe Dr. J, they interpreted it like I did.
I think
But like the
now
rationale
that-
was the same. Like everything could be, but
right.
I don't know.
I am reflecting, and I am full. Like, you have totally brought to my attention that I interpreted that wrong. Like, I added the could be, or could anything be, which is not how the sentence is written. So
Yeah.
ignore everything I said earlier and listen to Jess.
Okay, next question. What is not a sign of narcissism? So the options were lacks empathy, grandiosity, entitlement, or confidence.
This was you asked a good one here.
This is a good one.
I think people are going to pick grandiosity. That's my guess, even
Okay.
if that is not correct. But
I'm going to do confidence.
The correct answer is confidence, and 57% of our group members pick confidence. So
Damn,
20%,
smart.
They're bright little people.
yep, 20% said lack
Smart
empathy,
peeps.
13% grandiosity, and 10% entitlement.
y'all know
Okay.
your stuff.
What is not a sign of gaslighting? So the options were self-doubt in the victim, distortion of reality, saying the things the victim doesn't like, or gaining power or control.
I'm trying to think of how other people would answer it. Just tell us.
You just want me to tell it? Yeah,
Just tell
So
us. Yeah.
once again, our group members are on it. 77% said saying things the victim doesn't
There we
like.
go.
Like we already
Perfect.
covered, just because somebody
Wow.
disagrees with you doesn't mean you're being
so good.
gaslit. 12% said self-doubt, 6% distortion of reality, 5% gaining power or control. Okay, so then I asked, what is the most harmful or frustrating hot topic you see on social media? Let's see. Boundaries, I don't think a lot of people really get them. Everybody is a little ADHD or autistic. That everything in all capitals is a trauma response, and anyone who hurts you is a narcissist. Quick self-diagnostic tools that quickly water down the system and cause medication shortage. Misuse of terms like triggers and intrusive thoughts. Ooh, I like that one.
Wow.
That's my favorite one.
Yeah.
Toxic positivity.
Throw those love lifeline signs out.
Those who use the word triggers when they mean they dislike a behavior. DID being so misunderstood. Most things aren't PTSD, but a lot of things are trauma. I like that one. Quick fixes. We got a lot about quick fixes. Okay. And then I asked, what do you believe is the most helpful mental health topic on social media? Then somebody said boundaries again. So some people said boundaries are harmful. Self-awareness, mindfulness and attachment style, the idea that mental health is health, self-care and how it's different for everyone, destigmatizing disorders, normalizing therapy, providing resources, awareness of the range of mental health conditions, how to combat intrusive thoughts, that mental illness and mental health develop biopsychosocially, destigmatization. So we got a lot of good answers on that. And then the last question. When a new mental health topic is trending, who will be the first to make content about it? Justin, Jess, KBI, or K10?
KBI.
KBI all day.
Yeah.
All day.
because I just made a million pieces.
Everybody voted. Well, Justin won. It was very close between Justin and KBI. So Justin got 39%, KBI got 36%, I got 17%, and K10 got 8%.
I'm only the first because Justin is taking 6 to 7 business days to film a video that he's filmed 427 times, and I just filmed it in like 2 seconds.
And you are more in the know on social media than I am. You're always the first to know, whether it's a trend or a hot topic. KBI is your source. It is not me.
Yeah.
I find out through KBI.
It's because I dissociate while I scroll. No, I'm kidding.
No, she'll text me and be like, "Do you see this trend?" I'm like, "I don't even know what you're talking about." And then like 2 days later,
the audio has 1,000. I've seen all 1,000 of them, and I'm like, "You got to do this. It's gonna pop off." And then what does it do? It does.
It's like that time that KBI made us do that trend on the podcast, and none of us knew what it was.
No one knew.
I was like, girl.
The biggest letdown.
It was the biggest letdown.
We didn't know the trend.
I was on a different side of TikTok.
I'm on some weird sides of TikTok, but 8%. Damn, I'm gonna have to up my trend game, y'all.
Maybe it's just because they know you're so niched, so you're just not gonna hop on the trends. You're just gonna talk about sleep. She's too
cool for the trends.
Ooh,
I hope so. My nieces and nephews don't think so, so we'll see.
You know what? No one's too cool for.
Oh, that was so cringe.
I tried 6 different transitions. Y'all just kept going.
Sorry.
The
group member questions. This is what we all love. We're expanding this part of the podcast because y'all give us a mountain of questions to sort through every time. We love them. We get excited for them. We get interested. Where are you? Who are you? Can we come visit you? I mean, we ask all the questions.
We sleep on your couch.
Dive in. Can we just crash on your couch? Let's get straight to the point. Ashley from Manitoba, fellow therapist here in Canada. In Canada, psychotherapists can't diagnose. How do I reassure a client in the validity of their symptoms and experience when it's the diagnosis they want to make them feel validated? They've been convinced by social media that the only way to truly know if they are depressed is to have a diagnosis from a doctor, even though it's apparent to me they do, as they display multiple symptoms of depression. Great question, Ashley.
Wow. I learned something new just in her question. I guess it depends on the circumstance, Ashley. Like if the client knows, if you know for sure that the client has depression, I think it's really having conversations around really what depression means and all that stuff, even if there's not a formal diagnosis, if you know for sure. I've had clients come to me and they're not formally diagnosed, but I have a sense of what's going on. And we just have conversations about it. And I think the validity part is you don't need anybody else to validate your experience other than you. And I think sometimes we think, I need a diagnosis or I need to see a mental health professional. It is certainly helpful, but it's not necessary to feel validated, in my opinion. So if I think, wow, all these symptoms make sense for me, then they make sense for me. Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm. You know, but I think where it could be a little iffy is if it's not something as clear cut as depression, if it's something different, if it's like depression due to a medical circumstance where you need labs done. I mean, that's a little different. But if we're speaking generally, I don't think it's a bad idea to just have conversations around it.
This is so intriguing to me because I am definitely of the camp, if insurance didn't make me diagnose after the first session, I probably wouldn't diagnose until much later on, if ever, like only if they obviously meet a disorder. But my mind goes to maybe even asking the question, like, what do you believe would be different about your treatment if you had a name for it? Because in the mental health world, all diagnoses are based on a pattern of symptoms that disrupt your functioning. So we are treating the symptoms. Like the disorder is the name for the collection of symptoms, but the treatment is treating the symptoms of that disorder. So And I know a lot of people like a name for it, kind of going back to our conversation earlier, but I would explore, what is so important to you about having a diagnosis. How do you think your treatment would be different? You're listing X, Y, and Z symptoms. If, you look up or we pull out the ICD or DSM, whatever you use to diagnose, and you are able to recognize that those symptoms fall in that category, whether you have a name for it or not from me, we're still treating what you're coming to therapy for. And I know that might be hard for people because some people really like labels to help give words to it. But also, there's nothing, going back to the self-diagnosis, this isn't really self-diagnosis, nothing really stopping an individual saying that they have depression if you're talking about the symptoms and validating their experiences and doing interventions for that. I don't know. This is so interesting.
I know.
We all learned something new about Canada today.
Definitely.
And psychotherapists in Canada. Also, just to tack on, if it were that important, and I identified that in a client where I'm not allowed to pull out the DSM or whatever because of the rules in Canada, then if it were that important, I would identify it for that person and I would refer them out. Because I would be validating what their truth is, that they feel like they need to meet with, I don't know who can diagnose in Canada, maybe a psychologist, maybe an MD, DOPA, I don't know. But if it were that important, I would be like, then let me refer you to someone because you've identified you really want to know. But I totally validate and agree with everything that's been said. Eleni, if I butchered your name, come down from New Jersey and I'll buy you some great Cuban food down here in South Florida. But what are your thoughts on seeing a psychiatrist versus a therapist?
They're two different
Depends on
things.
what you're looking for.
They're two very different things.
Define them for us, KBI.
In the most simplest of terms, psychiatrist prescribes meds, and they might talk a smidge about your feelings and things like that, but they kind of want the facts of the symptoms to be able to prescribe you medications, whereas your therapist is going to get into the nitty-gritty. They want to talk about all of the feelings, all of the experiences, all of the details. That's kind of how I've always kind of described the difference between them, minus the fact of just the prescription of meds and non-prescription of meds. It's just how deep each person is going to dive into your not even your history, because hopefully the psychiatrist does a really well-rounded assessment, but the consistent dive into the history on a consistent basis, a psychiatrist is not going to do that.
Yeah, there are some psychiatrists who do psychotherapy.
Yeah.
But not typically.
Yeah.
Their goal, exactly what KBI laid out, is to prescribe you psychotropic medication that will help you. Where a therapist is exactly looking at behavioral patterns, cognitions, emotions. So we go back and we tend to stay back. And yes, some therapists work in the symptoms in the here and now, depending on theoretical orientation. But yeah, exactly right. It's prescribing medication versus doing psychotherapy is the big difference. They both have huge benefits, And I'm of the belief that one can guide you to the other, and they often do.
And the hope is that if you have both, they're working together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and collaborating.
The only thing I want to add is we're all speaking from a very American point of view, because I know in our American health system, psychiatrists tend to prescribe because that's how our healthcare system works, and the pay, unfortunately, is a lot lower for a therapy hour. But I don't know what it is like in other countries, where if psychiatrists are doing more traditional therapy plus prescribing meds in a 60 to 90 minute session. So I just wanted to highlight that obviously we are speaking from our experience in the American healthcare system.
Very valid. Very valid. June from OK. I believe that's Oklahoma.
Oklahoma.
Where the wind does blow. What is medical gaslighting? How do I know I am being gaslit by my doctor? That's a great question.
Well, we talked about gaslighting earlier. So, medical gaslighting is in a healthcare system where the patient, the person going to the doctor, feels like their complaints are being dismissed, discounted, discredited.
Mm,
We see this a lot, unfortunately, in women who present with like physical pains. It's usually written off as anxiety,
mm,
made to believe that your symptoms aren't real. You may leave the appointment feeling more confused. But yeah, so it's gaslighting, but in a specific interrelationship with a provider when you are the patient.
Definitely. I even think of like if, and the other end of this is like, just say you come in to the doctor with that self-diagnosis that you've looked at
mm.
online, right? And you're like, I think this is it, right? I think this is it. And the doctor's saying, hey, it could be all these other things, let's look at the whole spectrum. And just say you're hooked on that one. We call it confirmation bias. So you're just kind of fixated on that one diagnosis. And sometimes people can feel gaslit from the experience. And I think for some people it's hard because you want that to be so valid, and you really, really want that to be true. And it could be a variety of different things, but I've heard, and I've experienced this too, where I would go to the doctor and think it's one thing, and they're like, hey, consider this. And I left feeling really invalidated. It might not be the same as gaslighting. So I always like to discern the difference. But true medical gaslighting, really, you, like Jess said, you leave feeling like really confused and like, what just happened? Like, I'm the expert on like my experience. Like, they're telling me I didn't experience that when I did. So those sort of things would constitute medical gaslighting, I think.
It's funny how even the way a professional might word or validate what you've said to them can make all the difference.
Oh,
Of
yeah.
someone saying like, "Oh, I know you're complaining a lot of your head hurting. There's a lot of things that come to mind here, and we got to turn over some stones here to find out because we can't rule out maybe there is a mental health impact, but maybe it's something else that we haven't discovered yet." All of us would love that response every
Yes.
time from
Oh, yeah.
a medical professional, but unfortunately sometimes they're quick to dismiss and be like, yeah, you got anxiety. That's anxiety. Where it's like, I don't feel that. That was my story of having Chiari of my brain falling into my neck. And every doctor, until I got to the neurologist, told me it sounds like anxiety. I'm like, yo, sure it's anxiety, and I'm really like having some real like symptoms here, like blacking out, where I'm like, that's not anxiety.
Yeah.
So, but yes, we hope that doctors can work with us, validate what we're experiencing, and be curious with us of like maybe they don't know yet, because that happens a lot with
Oh, yeah.
disease and illness. Like they don't know, but they can at least hold the truth with us that we are experiencing what we say we are. Lexi, all the way from Scotland. Do you think social media is perpetuating mental illness? It feels like there's a video for every symptom to be illness. Some days, not sleeping is just not sleeping. It doesn't always mean anxiety, PTSD, etc. Thank you for that, Lexi.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought of this in two ways. Like when I first heard it, do you think social media is perpetuating mental illness? I'm thinking of the research on like the negative harmful effects of being on social media. And we do know that it's associated with like higher depression, anxiety, isolation. So in that case, like just being on social media can have negative effects on your mental health. As for perpetuating mental illness, I think it perpetuates misconceptions about what mental illness is. Because when I think of like perpetuating mental illness, I think of something that is like maintaining, sustaining, causing mental illness. But hearing your question, Lexi, which I loved, I think a lot of people, going back to self-diagnosis, may think they have a mental health condition based off of what they see on social media. There's misinformation that make people feel like they have a mental health condition when they don't. So I don't know if that even answered the question. Like, yes, and maybe not.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I think it can get to that level. I think a lot of people get information and can put together. In a way, that you're not sleeping, sometimes it's just not sleeping. Part of me is like, everything comes from somewhere, but is everything a big deal? No,
Right.
no. But you're not sleeping came from somewhere. And is one night of bad sleep a big deal? No, not necessarily. So just like spacing out and having moments of inattention, is it a big deal? No, not necessarily. And so that's definitely true. Like severity is a huge factor here of a lot of things we can experience in small quantities, quickly, fleeting. But this is why if you work in the field, you'll be like, the biggest factor is severity. Severity will dictate how difficult something might be to treat, how long it needs to be treated, and again, how much it's impacting or derailing someone's life, not necessarily the title of whatever we're talking about.
I was even thinking as I was listening to y'all talk, like, I think we've done, not just us, but society, we've done a really great job of reducing the stigma with mental health. And I think people are talking about it more too, you know? So I think just people showing up online to discuss their symptoms, it doesn't necessarily mean that it might be perpetuating the mental illness, but people are more so talking about their experience and people might be agreeing because they're experiencing it too.
100%. Well, Bradley, in the UK, how harmful is dissociation during your teen years, and what are the best ways to cope with it? Also, love the podcast. Bradley!
Thanks, Bradley.
Thanks, Bradley.
I guess my first thought, and y'all could agree or disagree with me, but I think dissociation in itself, in my mind, isn't technically harmful. Is it upsetting, emotionally draining, painful in terms of the aftermath? Sure. I think the consequences of dissociation can be the more painful part too, of like, I lost all this time, or I don't know how to tap back into my body, or I need to go to work and I'm really, really struggling to just like really come back into myself. So I think the consequences in terms of functionality, can be, I don't know, and harm. I'm trying to find a different word other than harmful. It might not be helpful, to maintain a job and all that stuff in terms of teen years. And I'm thinking of like even younger teens of missing school and stuff like that. You might, your grades might suffer, things like that. In terms of best ways to cope with it, I'm just thinking of therapy techniques of like grounding, body scans, stuff like that. And I guess it depends, like Justin said, on the severity. Like, how severe is it? How often are you experiencing it? What is it impacting? So those are my first thoughts.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Love all that. And definitely things that can make you feel in control, pull you into the moment. Because especially when I think about teens, a lot of things feel out of control. I know a lot of us, it's been some years. When you think back to those teenage years, it could feel like we have control over nothing. So I think if you're a parent, if you're a teacher, if you're a mentor, of course you're a therapist, helping people find ways to be present, be in control of things, find their regulation is very empowering and powerful for our teens out there. Renee from Iowa, how do you grieve the loss of a parent and still learn to thrive in your own life without feeling guilty about your accomplishments? Thanks for your time. I really enjoy listening to this podcast. Do you enjoy watching it, Renee? Do you enjoy watching our faces? You don't really enjoy it. Yeah. Okay. Listening. I'm curious. We do have to do a poll. I'm curious of listeners compared to watchers of this podcast.
Me too.
We'll run that. We'll put that in the socials.
I don't know. My first thought goes to guilt means you're making a mistake. And are you making a mistake by living your life? Of course not. Right. And then I think if my parent had passed, and Renee, if this is your situation, I'm sorry for your loss. I even think grieving happens in the moments of time when we're able to kind of sit and realize that it's happening, and you living your life might be, I don't know, it might be helpful because you could always share those moments with the person who has passed in your own time. I don't know, everybody's different with this, but when I grieve the loss of like my friends and family, I always think they'd be really excited for me right now, or, they'd be proud of me, or I wish they were here and I'm going to create a memory and maybe hopefully share it with them in my journal, So you can almost include them depending on, your comfort. I also think about, there are going to be moments in time when you feel like the grief is really bad and you don't quite know how to tap into yourself in terms of feeling a sense of gratitude of these accomplishments. And I think that's pretty true for anybody experiencing grieving. And it's just going to fluctuate, I think. And everybody's different with their grieving journey. So that's just my experience. What about y'all?
You said everything I was going to say, especially about if you have like a good relationship or had a good relationship with an individual that passed, reframing as like they would be proud of me for my accomplishment. They would want to celebrate this with me. Yeah, because, and I guess the only other thing I would ask is like, what is the source of the guilt? Why do you feel guilty that you are living your life without them? Is it, that you are worried that they wouldn't be proud of you? Do you feel like moving on means in some ways that you are forgetting them? And I would, kind of reflect on where that guilt is stemming from. And then if you can identify it, work through whatever the underlying cause of the guilt is.
Yeah, I love that. As I approach the age where my dad died of cancer, those are thoughts going through my mind as well. Like a little bit of guilt can kind of come up. I'm like, oh my God, I've almost lived as long as my dad lived. It's a very odd, sinking feeling, but as is the grief journey, it's windy. Taylor Rose out there in Nevada. We've talked on this a little bit, but I think we probably have a little more to say. What are your opinions on misinformation coming through social media? There seems to be a lot of videos placing diagnosis on common actions that may just be a collective experience, aka TikTok saying the way you write in cursive dictates your mental stability.
I feel like 50% of the content I make on social media is correcting misinformation.
I love your content. Yeah.
So,
And
I mean, I have very strong feelings.
I have really bad handwriting. I don't know what that says about me.
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, taking me and thinking of the collective of mental health professionals, like, I think it is frustrating for us as mental health professionals to see misinformation on social media on subjects that we went to school for years, are practicing. Just like I'm sure it's frustrating for like physicians to see misinformation about medical things out there. And I want to clarify, I'm not talking about like people sharing their personal experiences. I think that is so important for relatability. But when people are sharing incorrect information about mental health disorders, interventions, things like that as fact, it's more harmful than helpful in many ways. And then people like me, because I don't want to speak for anybody else, like are spending time correcting the misinformation on social media. It's frustrating.
Yeah. It is.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I always go back to like the client or the person is the expert on their experience. I'll never know what that's like. I just won't. I'm the expert on psychology, I'm the expert on like how symptoms happen for people, what they mean. If you think about any presenting concern, it could mean so many things. And it's up to us. I'll just speak for psychologists and speak for myself. It's up to us to figure out the puzzle piece and where it might fit. And it might fit in multiple places. That's why I think, Jess, you alluded to this earlier of not making a diagnosis in the first session. In private practice, I have the privilege and luxury of doing that, of having ongoing assessment, which I think most of us do. but really collaborating with the client and really trying to figure out what it might mean. And if you're on social media, that entire assessment and all of those therapy sessions, I mean, it's impossible to get that out on the internet because of HIPAA, number one. Number two, I mean, it's just really difficult to relay all that information, especially about a unique client. So I think there's so many nuances. But the thing that I go back to all of the time is, where is this information coming from? And is this person an expert in that field? Or is it a personal experience? And if it's a personal experience, it's just as valid, but it might not be the same experience for everybody, or it might not be the clinical presentation for every single person who might experience depression, for example. One example that I think of is with depression and sleep. So people who experience depression, they could either sleep a ton or have really, really deep issues sleeping. Both can indicate some level of depression, right? But it's two completely different experiences with sleep. So it just depends on the person and the unique experience, I think, too.
Totally. Alexis from Ohio with a sad face.
A sad face.
Listen.
I'd be sad too if I was from Ohio.
Who put the sad face in there? Did Alexa put the sad face?
Alexis, I think, put the sad face.
Oh, Alexis. Sorry.
Alexis, listen, you go eat yourself a pierogi. You get yourself some Skyline chili. If you're in the Northeast, how about a little Swenson's burger? Galley Boy?
Skyline chili is gross.
I'm just
I
naming.
have not heard of any of these things.
Well, it's cut. You ventured to Ohio. You've never had a pierogi? No pierogi?
Oh, I've heard of pierogi, but I just, they're not my jam.
Skyline chili is weird.
That sounds very weird.
It's Southern Ohio, but anyways. Yeah. A little more on self-diagnosis. Instead of completely self-diagnosing yourself with something, is it weird to bring up something you relate to / feel you may have to your therapist to see what their thoughts are?
Oh my God, I love it when my clients do. When I'm doing a new assessment, especially like with a teen, and maybe they're struggling to maybe turn what they're feeling into words, I'll say, are you on social media? Do you have any videos that you've saved that like you highly relate to that relate to your mental health? And if they say no, I will tell them, over the next week, I want you to pay attention and I want you to save things.
Love it.
And then they usually come back and I'm like, oh, okay. Because a lot of times, like, you know, when they bring it, like sometimes it's just a way that they've put things into words.
Oh yeah. I think it depends on your therapist too. Some therapists, you know, and how safe you feel. Hopefully people feel safe with their therapist, but it's up to the person and the client to decide. But I love when my clients send me stuff. Instead of the feelings wheel, I wish I could have a meme wheel, you know. Maybe one of these days I'll create one, but
Kate, I also love it. Bring it up. Listen to KBI. I think that's a great way to connect. Katie from Michigan. Wow, I didn't mean to do Ohio and Michigan back to back, but I'm not going to hold it against you, Katie.
Yes, you did. You planned that.
And Katie, I don't know. Someone needs to tell you you spelled your name wrong. So I'm totally messing with you, Katie.
Oh, Katie. I love their name.
That's a cool way to spell it.
CATIE is fun.
That is unique.
We're having a good time. Why do you think, and this was such a good question, Katie. I'm not even gonna, I read this with a huge smile. Why do you think Gen Z has such a dark sense of humor? I have a theory, but.
Oh, so do I.
Because they're being raised by millennials who've gone through many life traumas.
And they've also gone through some shit.
Yeah.
And they're so intensely insightful and aware that they're like feeling and seeing everything. And you're either going to choose to like really let it affect you or like have dark humor, in my opinion. I feel like it's like one or two camps. And most Gen Z folks that I deal with, they have the best sense of dark humor ever. I think even better than millennials. I'm just going to throw that out there. I think that's a hot take, but that's how I feel.
Or just the increase of memes.
Yeah.
Social media.
I think totally. I agree. But I also think you have to have an elevated knowledge on a topic to incorporate dark sense of humor. My take is when you're really far away from a topic, like, and I'm not mocking in any way, but the way baby boomers were, because of the generational differences. They were taught nothing about mental health. So it was so distant from it. It's hard. Like, you're almost scared of it in some ways. It's sort of like that foreign thing. And again, I guess some people probably could mock it, but I think using good dark humor, like, you almost have to have a lot of knowledge about the topic you're discussing. And I think that's true with good humor in general. And that shows that we can kind of cope in different ways. Again, using only humor, we know too much, but using every now and then some good dark sense of humor shows you're knowledgeable, you're reflective, and you're holding the truth of what is the mental health issue. And to me, again, you have to have a certain level of understanding of the topic to do that.
I love that theory.
Yeah.
Dark
Theory
humor
I
is my
made up.
favorite. It's my favorite.
So is it a theory or hypothesis? It's a hypothesis. We have to
There we
test
go.
it. Yeah.
We do. We need surveys, research, empirical
Need
data.
RTCs. Yeah.
Amy from Connecticut. My therapist has always, this was an interesting question that got into modern content creation, but my therapist has always kind of frowned upon pop psych stuff that shows up in social media because it's all kind of quick tips and quotes in generally nothing tangible or actionable that you can put into action to make a real change. But I find that sometimes a quick tip or quote can flip my perspective on something and help me understand something a bit better. I know you are all publicly present on social media, but what are your stances on how helpful, harmful psych on social media actually is? And I would add, you're also alluding to the modern era of content creation, which is short form. Hasn't always been that way.
Yeah. I think there's a place for all of it. And as much as I want to say I hate the pop psychology stuff, because, Amy, to your point, sometimes it's not tangible or actionable, I also think it could really shift perspective, like you said. And I call it like turning your mind and pulling from DBT. Sometimes you can be in a really weird headspace and you might see something or hear sounds or like really hear music that is so captivating that it does kind of, for even a couple of seconds or even minutes, give you some sense of reprieve. And it might not be a standardized evidence-based treatment for a certain diagnosis that you have, of course, but that's what therapy is for. And social media isn't therapy. So I do think that there is a time and a place for these things. I think where it gets sticky, to your point, you know, how helpful or harmful is it, is if people are only using the pop psychology stuff to self-diagnose and like make all these, you know, correlations and all of that. But I do think that we're alluding, or at least I'm alluding, to the greater scheme of the systemic issues. And I think Jess talked about that too. Access to mental health care is a privilege in some sense. And it's hard. It's hard to find a therapist that's in your network and that you vibe with. I mean, it's just hard. So I do think there's a place for it.
No, and I totally agree with that. And, you know, I mean, I think we've all been victim too of the opposite side of where we make short form content and, you know, it either misses the mark from the people who consume it, or there is a large chunk of individuals who consume it where it misses the mark with. Because the problem with the short form content as well is you also have to hope that the people who are consuming it are using some problem solving skills or some executive functioning to process what they're seeing. And I mean, I just had this the other week where I made a video and so many people in the comments were like, if a therapist said that to me, I would cry. I would hate it if my therapist. And it missed the nuance of like, yeah, I don't use this with every client. Like, this is only for a specific situation. And so that, I will say, that is the hard part about the whole thing, is like, you can definitely miss out on some nuance, but I do agree that, you know, it starts conversations.
Totally. And it is the modern form of content.
Yep.
So as professionals, it's easy, and I know this was mainly your therapist perspective, but it's easy to be like, those 15-second videos. But if that is the majority of content being consumed, we as professionals, we either have to get in or be like, you know what? There's no place to mention anything mental health related. And we ain't doing that. So you might not like it that it's not a 20-minute YouTube video going through all the diagnostic criteria, but we have those as well. But in a lot of the short form content, we're trying our best as professionals. That's my defensive posturing. And I know exactly like KBI said, we're all trying to figure out how to keep it in the forefront on people's minds and also know it is going to be limited. Last question here. I hope y'all like this format. We tried to tackle a lot of questions here tonight. Allison in North Carolina, just waving out your window to Jess, as we know, just right there, right next door neighbors. South Carolina, North Carolina, side by side.
At least you remembered I was in South Carolina this time.
I finally remembered.
I was waiting for him to say you lived in North Carolina.
I know.
I can't.
It's only taken about 30 episodes for me to remember, but here we are. Allison says, how do I navigate that most of my PTSD is from my mom, but since I'm not a parent, I don't have much cred and feel like moms are likely offended and don't believe me when I mention it?
I don't think you have to be a mom to understand that your mom caused harm. I mean, I realized that my mom caused me harm well before I had a child, to the point that I didn't want to have kids. Like, that harm made me not want to have children. Now, granted, I have a 5-year-old child who I couldn't picture my life without and has done immense healing. But, you know, I think that you don't have to be a parent to acknowledge that your parent hurt you.
Yep.
Yeah.
And even if they don't validate that or see you, doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Yeah.
You know, just because it is an experience for you and you're identifying that, their inability to maybe see you or meet you where you're at or meet you somewhere doesn't make it any less valid. I had to walk through that with my own healing journey with my parents too, of like, they might not really get it. And that's not up for me to decide if they get it or not. If they do, that's an added bonus, of course. But it's not necessary for healing. But it is, I know most people might say, yeah, but it makes it easier. It does. And it's okay.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of sad, guys, because I'm not going to be here for 2 more weeks.
I'm going to miss you.
Yo.
Are you breaking up with
Vacation.
us?
No. I'm breaking up with my job, though.
Yeah.
We love that for you. We love
I
that.
love that for you.
But no, I'm gone for 2 weeks. Maybe I'll pop in. Someone's
You
gotta
should.
be
Totally. We're going to be
Someone's
like
got to actually be
37 minutes in, and we're like in the middle of intense conversation, and then KBI just like
I'll
pops
be like,
in
what the
and is
fuck
like,
you guys
"Sup?"
doing?
Yeah.
I would
No,
love that.
sadly, I will not be here for the next 2 weeks, so you guys will have to hold down the fort without me.
We'll try.
I don't know how you'll manage, but
We'll do our best.
Not
we'll
well.
do it anyway. I know the group members will miss me. Out of anybody, they'll miss me, but it's okay. But I hope you guys really enjoyed this episode, especially to the start of Mental Health Awareness Month. This is going to be a wonderful month. We have some wonderful topics that we are going to be sharing with you guys, even though I won't be here for 2 of them. I promise I'll come back at the end of the month. Always remember to rate, subscribe, review, share it with your friends. Do all of the above, because that's how we get our podcast out there. And again, as we are going into Mental Health Awareness Month, we want to leave you with this reflection question that you can answer on our Instagram, right? How are you going to take care of your mental health this month? So let us know in the comments over there. We want to look at it. We want to see it. We want to hear it. How are you going to do it? And we will see you next week in group therapy. Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.